In fact, it wasn't until May 19, 1898, with the passage of the Postal Act, that Americans were allowed to send picture postcards through the mail. The postal card had been around since the 1870s, and for a penny it was how Americans conducted business and personal correspondence. It was how your great-great-aunt Mildred complained about the weather to her sister, and how Michigan Bolt and Nut Works notified its customers of an order. But it took an act of Congress to launch the American picture postcard. Jeff Burdick knew all about postal regulations. An author and scholar, he could be our most credible authority on the origins of the picture postcard in the U.S. As a result of severe arthritis, his mobility was limited. His life was dedicated to his card collections. In his book, Pioneer Postcards, Jeff Burdick speculates about the possibility of a government conspiracy suppressing the American picture postcard. The late development of the view card in America was not due to a lack of private enterprise or initiative, but because the Post Office Department insisted on regulations which could only make them unpopular. It probably will be denied that this was to protect the government postal, although that was its net effect. The World Columbia Exposition of 1893 really broke the souvenir view card impasse in America. The success of these cards emboldened publishers in all parts of the country to try out a series of views featuring historic points, resorts, and attractions to tourists and visitors. The World's Columbia Exposition of 1893 was a demonstration of the Industrial and Electrical Revolution. It sought to promote products and innovation, and it made first use of the picture postcard in America. At night, the lights dazzled visitors. 200,000 incandescent light bulbs illuminated the fair. In the daytime, it became necessary for dark-colored glasses to be used to protect the eyes from the reflection off of the White City. The Columbia Exposition of 1893 was supposed to celebrate the 400th anniversary of the 1492 crossing of Columbus. But they got a little behind, and on May 1st, 1893, Grover Cleveland, President of the United States, pressed a gold key that officially opened the fair. 28 million Americans attended the most spectacular event since the Exposition in Paris in 1889, when the Eiffel Tower was unveiled. Almost half of the population of the United States came to Chicago that summer to see what they called the White City. Fairgoers walked into their virtual futures. New products and technologies were unveiled that are still around today. The movie projector, the telephone system, the world's largest building, phonographs, the hamburger, an electric pickpocket detector, the electric chair, a movable sidewalk, pancake mix, the Ferris wheel, the world's largest stove, and let's not forget postcards. And right there with the invention of the picture postcard came the invention of the picture postcard collector. It's estimated that about half of all postcards sold were never mailed, but ended up in someone's souvenir book. Let's differentiate here between the souvenir card and the postcard. Often, souvenir cards would contain an advertisement on the back like this Professor Field's anti-bilious worm powders, or a jewelry store ad. According to Jeff Burdick, vending machines at the fair dispensed the artistically designed lithographs from the Charles Goldsmith Company. 2 for a nickel, 12 for a quarter. Goldsmith had the monopoly for postcards at the fair. And with the U.S. Post Office, these could go through the mail. And the backs looked exactly like the U.S. Postal of the time. The cards showed the major buildings at the fair, and of course, the aim of every collector is to obtain all. And with Jeff Burdick's book, it's possible to check which cards a collector has. I could not attend the fair. Well, I'd be 125 years old if I had. But I could buy this official souvenir guide to the fair. With it, I can take a little virtual tour of the grounds. Now let's go find the Statue of the Republic. She was 65 feet tall and stood in the Court of Honor back during the fair. The wonderful folks of Chicago gave her a makeover in the 1990s, And you can still find her in Jackson Park. If you want to put a ring on Big Mary's finger, you're going to need one 10.5 inches in diameter. She got moved to where the administration building used to stand here in the middle. But when she got her makeover, the wonderful folks of Chicago moved her to where the administration building used to stand. And now she faces Lake Michigan. But most of the fair is gone now. Fortunately, still here, the Museum of Science and Industry. The publishers' photographers would often return to Chicago and pose people and make postcards of various features of the city, some still around. State Street, that great street, and Rush Street, almost as great. The museum used Detroit publishers for their cards, and while the city grew, postcards flourished. Those lions, ever vigilant through the centuries. Even in these real photo postcards from the 30s. And still you can buy, happily, a reproduction of the famous Sorrow painting in the museum store. They had contracts with other museums, like in New York City. Long before New York was known as the Big Apple, it was the Wonder City, as in this 30s linen card. Detroit publishing photographers used what they call the eye of the poet to make their night skyline of New York. Seems like any time a city had a handsome profile on the waterfront, the photographers would rush to the water's edge and make the exposure. In Times Square, the Packard Motor Car Company would open up their showroom. Now my uncles, they didn't want a Cadillac or a Lincoln, they wanted a Packard from Detroit. The landscape was about to be changed from streetcar and horse and buggy to the automobile. But things never stay the same, you know. Here, one from 1906, and now the early cars in the late 20s. Howard Hughes' movie Hell's Angels premiered here in 1930. Through the 30s, the linen cars became popular, and the chromes followed. The Cola Wars were played out right there in Times Square. New York's the kind of place where you can wear your imitation snakeskin cowboy boots right down the middle of the street. And even the dogs make a fashion statement right here in front of the Metropolitan Museum of Art. And Detroit contracted with the museum to make what's known as art cards, like this one of the interior. And today, the museum is the final repository for Jeff Burdick's postcard collection, as well as holding exhibits of postcards. You can still buy postcards on the streets of New York of the monuments and the local attractions. You know, the brides still have their portraits made here, and some of the life of yesterday is still here today. New York buildings are like none other in the world. But it wasn't until they took away the last brick after the destruction of the old Penn Station that they thought they may have made a mistake. All that was left was postcards of it. So thanks to the efforts of civic-minded citizens like Jacqueline Kennedy Onassis, this old train station has been preserved for future generations. So on any given day for 100 years or so, it's going to look a lot like Grand Central Station around there. Back then, take your camera out and make a black and white postcard and send it off to your relatives. In a couple of days, they're going to get great joy out of it. Your video camera gives you color, motion, sound, and the internet gets it there almost instantaneously. "10 minutes to 4 in the early 20th century, and only one horseless carriage can be seen near the Flatiron Building. There were only 8,000 cars on the road then. 8 years later, 200,000 cars were on the road. By the mid-1920s, when Detroit publishing went bankrupt, there were 25 million automobiles in America. Mass production of automobiles as well as mass production of postcards were to have their phenomenal effect on life in America. Detroit, the city that would put the world on wheels, is also the city that would bring forward so many million American picture postcards, and they would in turn reflect so much American history. Take Ellis Island. So many of everyone's great-great-grandmother and grandfather would come through here to be in America. By 1900, nearly 500,000 immigrants entered the United States. By 1905, that number had doubled. They were from all over Europe, and in 1912, an additional 150,000 Italians entered the U.S. through Ellis Island. The Roosevelt era and the first decade of the 20th century was a remarkable time. More Americans were experiencing prosperity and leisure time than ever before. A trip to the White House in Washington was an adventure that included postcards.
October 29th, 11:30, 1907, Washington, D.C. This is the only town I've seen that touches Binghamton. Seen everything. Shook hands with Teddy. Take my word for it, he is all right. Don't forget about those shoes. Go into Strouch and Skinner's and pick 'em out for me, will you? Remember me to everybody. S.